When it rains, it pours. It's not raining in Ukraine yet, but there is water just about everywhere. Houses are flooded, streets are flooded, people are being forced to flee their land. What really happened? How did things reach this point? A dam was destroyed in Ukraine. Now, this is the Nova Kakhovka Dam. This is where it is on the map in the Kherson region. Kakhovka is Ukraine's fifth largest dam. It dates back to the Soviet era. And this dam was built in the year 1956, to be specific. It is 30 meters tall, some 3.2 kilometers long. This dam provides water to South Ukraine, or at least it used to. What this dam also did was provide water to cool the reactors of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And we have been telling you all about this nuclear power plant and how it is a security and an existential risk to not just Ukraine or Russia, but also to wider Europe. Time for the big question now. Who really destroyed this dam? Now, there are contradictory claims, much like everything else in this war, and we will get to that in a bit. First, let's just try and understand what you see on your screen. What do these images really mean? In a nutshell, they mean higher food prices, inflation. Even for you. You may be living thousands of miles away from this dam, but its debt will end up bleeding your pockets. Ukraine, remember, is among the world's top 5 grain suppliers. It supplies wheat to countries as far as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Egypt. Sri Lanka imports maize from Ukraine, as does Israel, even China, Portugal, Libya, among others. India, for that matter, imports sunflower oil from Ukraine. So does Qatar, the UAE, Kenya, Taiwan. And the destruction of this dam is going to affect all of these countries and all the others dependent on Ukraine. Let me just remind you that Ukraine's agricultural fields account for 9% of the global wheat exports, 15% of maize, 44% of sunflower oil. So what happens to these food crops when there isn't enough water to irrigate them? They die, and then the supply chain collapses. And before you know it, there's the impact in your kitchens. You see, the destruction of this dam has triggered this domino effect, and it also stands to impact the production of 80% of vegetables and fruits in Ukraine, a lot of which, by the way, are exported to parts of Europe. And I'm talking about basics like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, peaches, grapes. This dam would help irrigate their fields, and now without this dam, growing this produce will be impossible. And why do I say that? Because the parts of Ukraine in which these fruits and vegetables are grown receives just about 400 millimeters of rain each year, which is not enough to farm. And what's worse, restoring this dam could take anything between 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years. So essentially what we are staring at is yet another humanitarian disaster. And the question is this Russia blowing up yet another of Ukraine's critical infrastructure? Here's why else I used the word critical. This dam, like I mentioned earlier, provides water for cooling the nuclear reactors at the Zaporizhzhia power plant. The power plant still contains tens of thousands of kilograms of radioactive material. In case the cooling process stops, the nuclear fuel will start melting, which will then create high pressure, resulting in an explosion. And what happens following an explosion? A nuclear leak. The explosion will give rise to invisible radioactive clouds. They could travel anywhere depending on the weather. Those in the path will suffer from radiation poisoning and be at risk of developing cancer. The UN's nuclear watchdog is bracing for the worst-case scenario. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, has sent out a message to Ukraine and Russia asking the two sides to spare Zaporizhzhia's cooling pond. The IAEA wants to ensure that the pond has enough water to cool the nuclear reactors for at least some months. And this pond, by the way, is located very close to the now broken dam. Currently, this pond is full, but how long will it remain that way? That is hard to say at this point. The flooding that resulted from the dam's destruction puts at risk some 16,000 odd people. 8 settlements in the region are already flooded. Ukraine wants the dam destruction to be investigated as a war crime, even ecocide. What's that? Well, Article 441 of Ukraine's criminal code defines ecocide as mass destruction of flora and fauna, poisoning of air or water resources, and also any other action that may cause environmental disasters. But how can we be sure Ukraine did not stage this sabotage? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is pointing the finger at quote-unquote Russian terrorists. Kiev says Russia blew up the dam so that Ukraine's forces cannot cross the Dnipro River. Let me just read out at this point what Ukraine's intelligence agency has said exactly. The occupiers blew up the dam of the reservoir in a panic. This is an obvious act of terrorism and a war crime which will be evidence in an international tribunal. And this message was shared on Telegram. Basically, Kiev is saying Russia's plan was to widen the river. And like we have been telling you, the eastern side of the Dnipro is more or less under complete Russian control. But here's the other side of the story. Why would Russia blow up the dam? While the widening of the river will surely be a hurdle for the Ukrainian forces, but it will not be any different for the Russians. That's unless they are content with their gains and plan to not advance further. That said, destruction of the dam also means water supply issues for Crimea and other regions upstream of the Dnipro. Did Russia think it will get away with this crisis? What is Russia saying? Well, Moscow claims Ukraine blew up the dam with Storm Shadow missiles, the same ones that Britain sent. The Russia-installed mayor of Kherson, Vladimir Saldo, claims Kiev is trying to distract the world from its quote-unquote failures of the counter-offensive. What failures? Asked the Wagner boss. Remember Yevgeny Prigozhin? Well, he has been missing from TV screens since handing over Bakhmut to the Russian forces. And today, he made headlines once again with yet another attack on Russia's defense ministry. Well, the Wagner boss says Russia's claims of thwarting Ukraine's counteroffensive are nothing but, quote-unquote, wild fantasies. That's right. He said, and I'm quoting, to destroy 1,500 people, it must be such a massacre. Within one day, over 150 kilometers. One hell of a massacre. Therefore, I think that these are just some wild fantasies. Is Wagner a liar, or has he exposed the truth to power? We will, of course, tell you once we have an answer. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.